Well, these are without doubt some of the toughest times for the Indian economy. The COVID situation has been a nightmare at so many levels, the loss of lives, problems with vaccination and an economy that needs to be robust enough to deal with these challenges. The latest GDP numbers show a negative 7.3% growth. In a scenario like this, what can our economic planners do to get the economy fully on track? Joining us now, a very special guest, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Dr. Subramanian. Thanks very much for being with us. So we've compiled a lot of questions. Some our viewers have sent in. The rest we've sort of thought up ourselves. So the first question is this: can the economy recover unless India defeats COVID?
Very good evening, Vishnu, and a very good evening to viewers. So firstly, if you look at the way in which the economy panned out over the last 1 year, after the first quarter decline, we had predicted that with the pandemic in decline, the economy should recover. And it indeed did, with the third and the fourth quarter recording positive growth. In particular, the fourth quarter numbers now coming, and gross value added, the change in that, which is actually a better indicator of the economy because of the change in the subsidy accounting and the subsidies itself at 3.6%. In particular, if you look there as well, after 3 quarters of decline, the consumption increased by 2.7%. The investment grew by about 10.8%, and of which a good part was the construction activity growing by 15%. So if you look at that, and this is something that we had mentioned as well, if you would recall to your channel, I had mentioned the recovery, and that we're glad that it has transpired, which clearly shows that the fortunes of the economy are inextricably linked with the path of the pandemic itself.
Okay.
Now, of course, the second wave has been really, quite devastating in terms of the health impact. But if you notice, while the pace of increase was very, very steep, the pace of decline is as steep as well.
Sure, that certainly gives us hope. It does indeed give us hope.
In yesterday's presentation, I had mentioned this as well.
Yeah.
So once the second wave troughs out and a lot of the local restrictions are removed, we should expect economic activity to come back, and which they should enable the recovery. In other words, the recovery was happening till March. Some of that momentum has been dropped because of the second wave. But once the second wave, is done with, I think the momentum should come back.
Well, let's hope that is the case, because the real worry now is, will there be a third COVID wave? And if there is one, can the economy actually afford it?
If these questions are you're asking as if we can sort of economists can control the third wave. We would have loved to do that if that were the case.
I know you can't control the third wave. I'm asking if you can control the economy if there is a third wave. Let's face it, it is a possibility, and let's pray that that's not the case.
As I was mentioning, not only in India but across the world, the economic fortunes have been quite linked with the pandemic itself. One redeeming feature that has been observed across countries is that the impact of the second wave has not been felt as much as the first wave, because countries have learned to work with the pandemic itself. And the second thing that is quite becoming quite important is vaccination itself, the pace of vaccination. And here, the evidence seems to suggest that even the first dose itself seems to matter a lot in providing, protection on average. Of course, there are cases of people, we all know of individuals, some individuals who have gotten, the virus despite getting the first dose, or maybe even sometimes the second dose. But when you look in aggregate, what is very clear, US, UK, Israel, other countries as well, these are 3 countries which are quite vaccinated a large proportion. the vaccination is indeed providing, protection.
Sure.
So I think that's the second thing that has to be really emphasized upon. The pace of vaccination has to be accelerated, because as we are mentioning, the fear of the pandemic declining is quite critical for the uncertainty.
And you've hit the nail on the head. We keep saying this on a daily basis: vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. At this juncture, we don't have the vaccines. The government has said that the vaccines, there's going to be an uptick in vaccine procurement, 2 billion doses by the end of December. And as all of these doses progressively start coming in, we can vaccinate up to 1 crore, a day. And that's a huge number. But in order for that to do, for us to be actually able to physically vaccinate at 1 crore a day, requires an uptick, which is what, at least 4 to 5 times what we are seeing now. So quite apart from the physical acquisition of vaccines, isn't the actual process of vaccination something we haven't talked about enough? Isn't that going to be the biggest challenge? In villages, people are scared, getting vaccines out there, going. So tell us your thoughts on the physical administration of the vaccine.
So that's a good point, Vishnu. I would like to point out that, if you looked at the peak vaccination rate that we have achieved, that was in excess of 40 lakhs a day, about 42 lakhs. And this is with just, us doing one shift of about 8 to 9 hours of vaccination. Now, 1 crore is essentially about, 2.5 times that, the 42 lakhs. If we are able to do it, in 2 shifts and maybe even possibly 24/7, then it is certainly possible to be able to vaccinate at 1 crore a day. And I think that should be a target that we should be aiming for, because the sooner we vaccinate greater proportion of the population, the better it is. One other aspect that I must mention is also the seroprevalence. If you recall, the ICMR survey in December had shown that about 21% of the population had antibodies because of the infection that they had gotten. And now with the second wave, the estimates, and a lot of people have actually discussed this with a lot of researchers as well. The estimates would be that, close to maybe 40% of the population may have the antibodies. So if you're able to, keep in mind that there may be some duplication. In other words, people who have the antibodies may be getting the vaccination as well. But to the extent that, let's say, the rural areas, if you are able to vaccinate more, because that will really sort of reduce some of the double counting, that can enable in us getting closer to the herd immunity. One key point I want to mention: we've been looking at some evidence for the United States, for instance, states across the United States controlling for a bunch of other factors. What we see is that about 25% or so seems to be a threshold where, after which the death rates really does decline. Now this is for one country, of course, but I think that evidence is also something that is quite pertinent for us to keep in mind.
Sure.
And especially the first dose itself seems to have an impact. Second dose adds some impact, but the first dose itself is also quite important.
And what
so I
will
think
be,
it is possible to do 1 crore a day.
And what will be a game changer is when we have single dose vaccines. When we have single dose vaccines, that will be a game changer in so many respects: the speed of administration, the protection that it affords. But let me ask you this. I'm not getting into why we didn't procure enough vaccines last year. Perhaps we should have bulk ordered, we didn't. But then a common question that is asked is, do we really have the funds available to procure 2 billion doses by the end of December? And the reason I ask it is, Covishield might be the cheapest vaccine in the world at approximately 200 rupees, what the government pays, but then you've got a Sputnik, which is $10 a dose. If Pfizer comes into India, then, abroad they're what, $30 to $35 a dose. So you will have a variety of prices and 2 billion doses. Would you be able to finance all 2 billion doses, obviously in tranches, linked to delivery without a problem?
So, Vishnu, let me first clarify, in my earlier observation, what I was saying was that even with a 2-dose vaccine, the first dose seems to have a significant impact. The second dose adds on to that impact. That's what I was trying to say. Now to your question, the way I look at it is, if, for instance, by vaccinating large sections of the population, we're able to reduce the fear of the pandemic, and as we've seen with the first wave itself, once the fear of the pandemic got reduced, economic activity really picked up significantly. So from that perspective, whatever we can do to vaccinate, I think, the cost of that will not be as high compared to the benefit that we get from, economic activity.
What will the cost be? What is the estimated cost for 2 billion doses? Because the health ministry has listed out what is coming. What's the cost?
See, as you yourself are pointing out, the prices are different across different suppliers. The budget had provided about 35,000 crores, for the vaccination. And the Honorable Finance Minister had also mentioned that if additional money is required for this, it will be provided for. The key point that I'm making is that, in terms of the kick or in terms of the benefit that we get for economic activity from
100%. 100%. There is no two ways about that. But I want to ask you that question again. How much is it going to cost us? Because this is a number which would have come to your table, right? What will it cost for us to vaccinate all of India? In other words, adults in India.
Gautam, Vishnu, what you're asking me here is actually conditional on the way in which this is, the vaccination program pans out. Because if we continue on the current path, which is, part of it through the private sector, part of it through the, government sector, public sector, of which some through the state government, some through the central government, then of course the cost will differ significantly. So the actual number will really depend on which of those,
so just to the government, forget about states, and that may change in the future, we don't know. But at the moment, if we go by what we have now, and the center is procuring the large number of vaccines, right? What would the center be paying for these doses? And the center is paying for, correct me if I'm wrong, 45 plus citizens in the country right now.
So as I was mentioning earlier as well, I think the right perspective to have here is that the benefits that we get from the vaccination are far higher than the costs that actually will have to be paid for us.
Okay, fair enough. I won't tie you down anymore with the cost. Perhaps that really does need to be worked out. But just one point you mentioned, which, some would disagree with. You said that even one vaccine helps. Now, obviously, it would. But if you look at the percentage of efficacy of a single dose, even if it's Pfizer or AstraZeneca, as per the latest studies in the United Kingdom, it's just 33 point something %. So it's not very much. So there's a debate on whether that second dose needs to be brought up. So the point is this: a single dose is good, obviously, something is better than nothing, but it's just not good enough. So we need to be thinking of 2 doses. I'm sure you'd agree with that. This is what the data in the UK clearly says.
Vishnu, what I was mentioning was that, if you look at the studies, there are now several studies which are showing that even if, let's say, the lag between the first dose and the second dose is, for instance, let's say 180 days. There are papers that, I have read in many of these, the top journals. What I'm finding is that many of these research studies are showing that even with such lags, and I must mention that I'm a consumer of this research, not a producer of this research, as I am on the economic side. And so, but from what I've read, it seems like even if with a lag of about 6 months, it's possible that the efficacy of the vaccine program is not affected as much. That does give you some, leeway in being able to spread out the vaccine. What one is not saying is to say just do one dose. Do 2 doses, but maybe staggering could help in being able to do this. For instance, Canada, and I was actually reading about this, Canada has decided that it will vaccinate all the entire population, give it the first dose, and then start giving them the second dose. And, different countries have used different policies.
Sure. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about what the economy says. Now, FICCI had a report which actually came out a little bit before you presented your GDP numbers, and they've said that India's business confidence index has nosedived. How can this be fixed?
So, Vishnu, if you look at the last 2 months, and we tracked several high-frequency indicators. For instance, the Google mobility indicators, and yesterday in my presentation I had shown as well. Both on the grocery activity and retail activity. April and May they have been declining. But one aspect that is revealing is that in the last 10 days, as the pandemic actually has started declining, these have picked up significantly, both the e-way bills and your power demand. And this I'm doing an apples to apples comparison by comparing for the same period last year as well. As it happened after the first wave, when the pandemic started actually coming to closer to its trough, the impact on the economy also started seeing in a positive way, and I think that is being seen. I will mention that up until March, the economy had recovered very well, as I had mentioned early on, your question, in terms of if you look at consumption, in terms of especially the investment, construction activity. So I see no reason why, and not just hope,
right,
but actual evidence based on what has happened, why, once the pandemic, actually second wave starts declining, why the same thing should not happen again.
Okay, so my next question is this. Uday Kotak, in fact, in an interview to NDTV, has called for printing money to save economy. Should India do this?
So first thing to keep in mind here, Vishnu, is that the budget which was presented, and that the budget is for the entire year of 12 months, had adopted a significantly expansionary stance in terms of the fisc. Not only was the fiscal deficit much higher for the last year, it has come at 9.3%, but even for this year itself at about 6.5%. So clear expansion in the fisc with a special emphasis on infrastructure spending, capex spending, and which will resume once the restrictions are lifted. And that is quite critical because it creates jobs in the informal sector for the urban poor, and those are important. But I think that said, what I will still mention is that we remain committed to hearing from all stakeholders, examining what is the impact, and be ready to respond based on some of the suggestions that come our way.
Okay. Now, Mr. Kotak has also mentioned, consider spending around 1% of our GDP for direct cash transfer to the poor. Is this not important, considering that unemployment now is a real concern?
So as I mentioned, along with the increase in the spending, the government spending, especially on the construction side, what you have also what we've observed over the last 1 year is that Manrega demand, for instance, was significant. Now, if you notice, in the month of May, the demand for Manrega was not as high as it was last year. So distressed work in the rural areas, the demand for that has not been as high as last year. But if there is demand for that, Manrega, the allocations can certainly go up, along with the spending on infrastructure. But we are actually open and considering the need for additional measures. As you would have noticed over the last few weeks, the emergency credit scheme has been extended to other sectors, for instance, the travel and tourism. So the government is willing to actually look at these suggestions, very carefully, and after balancing all the different aspects, which is really critical for any policy maker, we will definitely respond.
Would you agree, therefore, that unemployment linked to COVID is perhaps the biggest single economic and social concern?
I think not only in India, if you had noticed, even in the advanced economies, the US, the unemployment numbers and people, for instance, claiming unemployment insurance in the United States had gone up significantly, both in the first wave and in the second wave. The restrictions that get imposed because of the need to arrest the spread of the pandemic does have its impact. And I think world over, there has been an impact on the employment situation because of the pandemic, and India is not an exception either. And that is why the government has taken significant measures, especially on the on capital spending on construction. As I was mentioning earlier, in the fourth quarter, construction activity increased 15%, and this is a very important sector that creates a lot of jobs for the urban poor. So I think as with the rest of the countries, it does behoove us to actually keep this in mind, and we've been doing so.
A last question, and we're running short on time. I don't know how you're going to answer this fast. Anyway, per capita private consumption expenditure, it's plunged to 2016, 2017 levels. That really does desperately need to be fixed. Without private consumption going up, people buying, people taking loans, we're in trouble. So per capita private consumption expenditure, what needs to be done?
So the consumption expenditure, as as we had discussed in the fourth quarter, had gone up by 2.7%. And if you look at overall the evidence across countries as well, investment, especially on infrastructure and construction, does put money in the hands of people and actually leads to spending, on the consumption side. So I think, the emphasis on that will continue. Especially there is a case for front loading some of the planned expenditure on infrastructure, so that some of the impact of the second wave can be alleviated. I think overall these are times that across the globe countries have experienced unprecedented situations, and I think the Indian government has also been receptive to the demands for responses to this, and we'll come up with responses. We will continue to do so.
All right, Dr. K.V. Subramanian, thank you so much for being with us, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, sharing some of the suggestions that you have on what we can do in this present situation. It's not easy by any means, but we really need to improve on vaccination to get out of the present rut and ensure that economic growth takes place on a sustained basis. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.